The woman beneath his overpass was bleeding out, and she had a gun pointed at his chest. Officer Dominic Rail had worked the night shift in Cairo City for 11 years. He had seen overdoses, stabbings, domestic calls that ended in handcuffs, and somebody's broken furniture on the lawn. But he had never pulled up to a wrecked ambulance at 2:19 a.m. and found a nurse lying in her own blood with a Glock trained on his face, hands steady, eyes locked, breathing controlled despite the dark stain spreading through her scrubs. She was dying. She knew it. And she still wouldn't lower the gun. "Stay back," she said. "You don't know what you're walking into." He almost listened. If this story already has you gripped, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The call came in at 2:06 a.m. as a reported vehicle accident near the Kelwick Overpass, eastern edge of Cairo City, where the industrial corridor met the old freight rail line and nobody went voluntarily after dark. Dispatch flagged it as a possible injury, no other units in the area, and Dominic Rail had been the closest car by 4 miles. He drove with his window cracked because the night air helped him stay sharp on late shifts, and because 11 years of patrol work had rewired something in his nervous system so that silence felt louder than radio chatter. The call felt routine. Dispatch said an ambulance had possibly clipped the barrier on the service road. Maybe a driver fell asleep. Maybe a medical emergency behind the wheel. It happened. What he found was not routine. The ambulance was nosed into the concrete embankment at the base of the overpass, its front end crumpled and both front tires blown. The emergency lights were still cycling, red and white strobing across wet asphalt and the rusted underside of the bridge above. No other vehicles. No bystanders. The freight line to the east was dark and silent. Dominic pulled his cruiser to a stop 30 feet back, cut the siren, and stepped out with one hand on his radio and the other resting near his holster. He moved toward the ambulance slowly, scanning the perimeter without looking like he was scanning it. The driver's door was open. The cab was empty. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't match the scene, low and deliberate. Not a moan or a cry, but something more controlled. Breathing. Measured breathing. The kind someone uses when they're managing pain rather than surrendering to it. She was on the ground on the far side of the ambulance, her back against the front wheel, both legs extended in front of her. Blue scrubs dark from shoulder to hip on her left side. The gun was in her right hand, already raised, already aimed, and her eyes were on him before he had even cleared the front bumper. Dominic stopped moving. "Stay back," she said. Her voice was rough but level. No tremor. "You don't know what you're walking into." "Ma'am, I'm a Cairo City Patrol officer. I'm here to help you." "I heard you." Her eyes moved briefly to his cruiser, then back to his face. Not panic sweeping. Assessment. "How long have you been on shift?" The question caught him off guard. "Excuse me?" "How long? Tonight. When did you clock in?" 6 p.m., he said slowly. Why does that matter? Something in her expression shifted, a calculation completing itself. The gun didn't lower, but her grip adjusted and she exhaled carefully. "Did you hear my call go out on dispatch?" "I got a vehicle accident report, Kelwick Overpass Service Road." "That's not what I called in." Her jaw tightened. "I called a priority medical assist, officer down, possible hostile contact. That's not what they logged." Dominic held very still. "Who altered it?" "That's what I need to find out." She coughed once, sharp and suppressed, and he saw the effort it cost her. "I need you to step to your left, slowly. I want to see if anyone came in behind your unit." He did it. Because something in the way she spoke, the economy of it, the zero-wasted words, made him move before he had consciously decided to. He stepped left, angled toward the embankment, and looked back at the road. His cruiser sat alone in the amber pool of a distant sodium light. Nothing behind it. No headlights on the approach road. Nothing moving on the overpass above. "Clear," he said. "How many?" "Just me." She held the gun on him for another 3 seconds. Then she lowered it onto her thigh, and that was when he got a clear look at how badly she was hurt. 2 entry wounds, he was almost certain, one high on the left shoulder, one lower, closer to the ribs. The scrubs were saturated. She was pale in the ambulance's strobing light, sweat beading along her hairline, but her breathing was still controlled, still deliberate. "You need to let me call this in and get you an ambulance," he said. The ambulance is what they used to get me out here. Her eyes stayed on the overpass above. Think about that before you key your radio. Dominic thought about it. He thought about the altered dispatch call. I thought about the fact that she was a nurse who had driven a medical vehicle to an isolated location at 2 a.m. and taken 2 gunshots and was still, somehow, composed. He thought about the Glock on her thigh and the way she had swept the overpass before he had thought to. He thought about the fact that she'd asked how long he'd been on shift before she'd decided whether to trust him. He knelt down beside her. Let me see the wounds. I've already applied compression. Left shoulder, through and through. Lower left side, I can't confirm exit. She paused. I have 2 trauma dressings in my left cargo pocket. I can't reach them. He reached past her and found the dressings exactly where she said they'd be. She walked him through the application without being asked, pressure angles, contact points, and he followed her instructions because she clearly knew more about what she needed than he did. What's your name? He asked while he worked. Elena Voss. You're a nurse at Hargrove Regional, Trauma Unit, 4 years. She glanced down at his hands, checking his work without making it obvious. You're doing fine. Thanks, he said. He wasn't sure if the flatness in his voice was irritation or something closer to unease. Elena, someone shot you. I need to know who. I don't know their names. She shifted slightly to let him access the lower wound. I know what they're protecting. And what's that? She looked at him then, directly, for the first time, not sweeping the perimeter or calculating threat angles. Not here, she said. Get me somewhere that isn't on Hargrove's radio frequency, and I'll tell you everything. He half carried her to his cruiser and put her in the back seat rather than the front, because the back had more room, and because he needed both hands free to drive. He didn't call it in on his primary radio. He used his personal cell phone to call his sergeant, Marcus Tell, directly, and kept it vague. Possible shooting victim, unstable scene, needs to be logged off book until I know more. Marcus had known him 11 years and trusted him in the way that police supervisors only trust officers who have never given them a reason not to. He said he'd call it in as a welfare check with no details attached. Dominic drove to the secondary substation on Weller Road, a satellite office used mostly for paperwork and shift change briefings. It was empty at this hour. He got Elena inside and onto a folding cot he dragged from the supply closet, and he kept her awake by talking while he ran a proper visual assessment of the injuries under better light. She was right about the shoulder. Through and through, clean margins, missed the subclavian by what looked like inches. The lower wound was worse. He couldn't tell entry angle, couldn't confirm the exit, and she winced when he pressed carefully at the left flank, which told him something might have clipped the lower rib. She needed imaging. She needed a surgeon. Hospital, he said, not Hargrove. There's a trauma center at Marvel General, other side of... Is it affiliated with Hargrove's administrative network? He stopped. I don't know. Then not yet. She was watching his face. I know how this sounds. It sounds like someone shot you and you're refusing medical care because you don't trust the hospital system. Someone sent a falsified dispatch call to lure me out here, and then sent 2 people to make sure I didn't come back. The only reason they failed is because I saw the passenger before I stopped the vehicle. She paused. I got the driver's side window down and was moving before they reached my door. Dominic sat back on his heels. You were shot twice. I was shot once while moving. The second one caught me when I got behind the ambulance. Her voice was matter of fact. Not proud of it, not minimizing it, just reporting what happened. Elena. He picked his words carefully. That's not how a trauma nurse reacts to an ambush. She met his eyes. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, no, it's not. He waited. I was a combat medic, she said. Special operations. 8 years, 3 deployments. Medical evacuation unit, forward operating positions. She said it the way people say things they have said before to people who didn't really need to know. Efficiently. Without weight. I got out 4 years ago. I went to nursing school because it was close enough to what I knew that it felt like continuity. Hargrove hired me because my trauma scores were high and nobody read past the civilian education section of my application. So nobody at the hospital knows. The HR director knows there's a military service notation. She's never asked what it was. Elena shifted against the cot, jaw tightening. I wasn't hiding it. I just wasn't offering it. Dominic stood up and moved to the window. The parking lot outside was empty and orange lit. He was turning it over, the controlled breathing, the field dressings, the tactical sweep of the overpass, the question about his shift length. All of it clicking into place now in a way that made him feel slightly foolish for having needed the explanation. "You said you know what they're protecting," he said. "Yes." "Tell me now." "Before anything else." She exhaled through her nose, a slow, measured release. 3 months ago, I started noticing a pattern in our trauma intake logs. Patients arriving with injury profiles that didn't match their documented histories. Multiple cases, all routed through the same dispatch sequence, all involving controlled pharmaceutical inventory that showed as administered but didn't match patient charts. She paused. "I thought it was documentation error at first, bad charting, overworked staff, but the pattern was too clean, too consistent." "Clean how?" "Every irregularity appeared in charts handled by one of two attending physicians. Same inventory discrepancies, same falsified route notations, and the dispatch codes." She stopped. I recognized the codes, not because I'd seen them in a hospital before, because I'd seen the same sequencing structure used to obscure supply chain communications during a forward operation. Dominic turned from the window. "You're saying the hospital is running a covert supply operation?" "I'm saying someone inside Hargrove Regional is diverting controlled medical inventory through falsified emergency dispatch channels, and they've been doing it long enough and carefully enough that they had to have learned it from someone with operational training." She held his gaze. "And when I started documenting it, someone found out." The room felt different now, smaller. The fluorescent buzz of the overhead light seemed louder. "Who did you tell?" he asked. "Nobody. I was still building the record." She almost smiled, not warm, just dry. "Obviously, I waited too long." Dominic spent the next 40 minutes on his phone. He worked through databases he had access to, and a few he accessed through Marcus without explaining why, pulling up everything publicly attached to Hargrove Regional Medical Center. Administrative filings, state inspection records, incident logs. What he found was unremarkable. Hargrove was a mid-sized regional trauma center, 11 years established, decent ratings, no significant sanctions on record. Then he pulled the dispatch logs for the current shift and cross-referenced them against the call that had sent Elena to the overpass. The log showed a routine vehicle breakdown call. No medical assist, no officer down flag. Nothing that matched what Elena said she had reported. Whoever altered it had done it fast and done it clean. He went back to where she was lying on the cot. Her color was worse than it had been 20 minutes ago, which meant the lower wound was doing something he couldn't manage with field dressings and a first aid kit. She needed a surgeon. He needed to make that happen without walking her into whatever network she was afraid of. "I'm going to call someone," he said. "His name is Garrett Poole. He's a detective, financial crimes unit. We've worked adjacent on 2 cases. He's not connected to anything medical, and he's not connected to anything that touches dispatch." "What does he owe you?" "Enough." She considered this. "Make the call." He stepped outside and called Garrett Poole at 3:08 a.m., which was the kind of call you only made to someone who would pick up. Garrett picked up on the second ring. Dominic said, "I have a situation, and I need you to listen before you say anything." Garrett listened. By the end of it, Garrett said, "Give me 30 minutes and don't go anywhere." Garrett arrived in 32 minutes, in plain clothes and a personal vehicle, with a trauma surgeon friend named Dr. Adira Mack, who had privileges at 3 hospitals, none of which were Hargrove. Dr. Mack looked at Elena's wounds, looked at Dominic, looked back at Elena, and said, "How are you still talking?" "Practice," Elena said. Dr. Mack worked on Elena in the substation's break room for an hour and 20 minutes. Garrett stood in the hallway with Dominic and listened to everything, and Dominic watched the detective's expression move from skeptical to unsettled to something that looked like a man recalculating a situation he thought was smaller than it was. "Falsified dispatch," Garrett said, cross-referenced against her account. "The log doesn't match." And she documented the inventory discrepancies. On her personal device, she said she was building the record before she reported. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck. Who at the hospital would have the access to alter those dispatch codes and route falsified calls? "That's what I need you to help figure out." Dominic looked down the hallway toward the break room door. She said the coding structure was something she recognized from military operations. Someone with that background, or someone trained by someone with it, or someone who bought that knowledge. Garrett's voice was flat. Dom, you know what that sounds like? Yeah. Trafficking adjacent. Supply diversion at that scale with that kind of operational cover. I know what it sounds like. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. I'm in. But I'm bringing this to the federal desk in the morning. We can't run this through Cairo City PD channels if there's any chance dispatch has been compromised. Agreed. Dr. Mack came out at 4:41 a.m. and told them the lower wound had fractured the 11th rib, but hadn't perforated the lung. An inch of difference between a conversation and a funeral, she said. And she said it without drama, the way doctors who work emergency hours learn to say true things. Elena was stable. She needed 48 hours of monitored rest before anyone moved her, and she needed antibiotics and imaging that they couldn't do here. Can she talk? Dominic asked. She's been talking since I started, Dr. Mack said. That's not going to stop. He went in and sat in the chair beside the cot. Elena was propped slightly, a proper pressure bandage in place, an IV line that Dr. Mack had produced from a kit bag running into her left arm. She looked marginally better than she had at the overpass. She also looked like someone running on a resource that was depleting faster than it was being replenished. Garrett Poole is taking this to federal channels, Dominic said. Financial crimes initially, but if the trafficking angle holds up, it'll go higher. Good. She turned her head to look at him. How much do you know about Hargrove's administrative structure? Almost nothing. I've responded to calls there. I know the emergency wing layout. The emergency services director is a man named Dr. Colfax Harn. She said the name carefully, like it meant something specific. He's been at Hargrove 11 years, as long as the hospital has been operating. He designed the dispatch integration system they use. He wrote the protocols. He could alter dispatch logs. He's the only person on the administrative side who would know how to do it cleanly enough that a casual audit wouldn't flag it. She paused. And he has a secondary consulting contract with a logistics firm called Van Trade Solutions. I found the filing when I was pulling documentation. It's not illegal on its face. But Van Trade shows up in the paperwork trails attached to two of the physicians whose charts flagged in my review. Harn. Dominic said the name quietly, testing it. Elena. If he's behind this, why would someone at his level take the risk? Because supply diversion at a hospital scale, protected by falsified documentation and corrupted officials, generates millions. And if you're the person who designed the system, you also designed every exit. She held his gaze. He didn't think anyone would find it, and when someone did, he made one phone call. The break room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, the first thin gray light of morning was reaching the parking lot, and Dominic could hear a car moving on the distant highway. The night shift was ending. Day shift was coming on. At Hargrove Regional, people were arriving for work who had no idea their emergency director had ordered a murder 2 hours ago. You need to sleep, he said. I'm aware. I mean it. You've been running on adrenaline since the overpass, and that's going to bottom out. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, When I was deployed, second tour, we had a medic in our unit who used to say that adrenaline is just borrowed time. You spend it, you pay it back. She closed her eyes. I know exactly what I owe. He stood up and moved toward the door. Officer Rael? Her voice stopped him. He turned. The documentation I built on Harn's supply diversion. It's on a personal drive, encrypted. The drive is inside the lining of my trauma bag, which is still in the back of the ambulance at the overpass. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. That evidence is the only thing that moves this forward. Without it, everything I've told you is a wounded nurse with a story. Dominic held her gaze. He thought about the wrecked ambulance sitting under the overpass with its lights still cycling. He thought about whoever had shot her. 2 people, she'd said, and whether they'd gone back to finish what they started or to search the vehicle. How long does the encryption hold if someone gets to the drive? Long enough, she said. If you move fast. He took his keys off the break room table. Don't go anywhere. The dry sound she made might have been a laugh. Noted. The overpass was quiet when he pulled up at 5:14 a.m. The ambulance was exactly as he'd left it. Nose in against the embankment, lights still going, driver's door still open. No other vehicles. No sign anyone had returned. He moved fast and methodical. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel approaching the vehicle a second time. But what he actually felt was a heightened alertness that sharpened every edge of the scene. The smell of radiator fluid on wet concrete, the tick of the cooling engine, the way the strobe light made the shadows jump. He checked the cab, checked underneath, moved around the rear. The trauma bag was on the floor behind the driver's seat, partially obscured by a toppled equipment case. He found it, checked the lining as Elena had described, and felt the flat weight of a small encrypted drive sewn into the inner seam. He was reaching for his keys to head back to his cruiser when his radio crackled. Dispatch. All units, be advised. Cairo City PD is requesting a welfare check at the Kelwick Overpass Service Road in response to an anonymous report of an abandoned emergency vehicle. Any available unit, please respond. He stood very still in the dark beside the ambulance. Anonymous report. Not his report. Not Marcus Tell's logged welfare check. Someone else had called it in. Someone who knew the ambulance was there and wanted official eyes on this location at exactly this moment. Dominic pocketed his drive, walked back to his cruiser at a normal pace, and drove away before any other unit could arrive. He was 3 blocks from the overpass when his phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize. You took something that doesn't belong to you. Return the nurse and the drive before 8 a.m., or this gets worse for both of you. He read the message twice. Then he drove faster. At 5:31 a.m., he walked back into the Weller Road substation, and the look on Garrett Poole's face told him something had already changed. We've got a problem, Garrett said. Someone filed a report with Cairo City PD in the last 20 minutes. Nurse Elena Voss reported as a missing person by Hargrove Regional Administration. The filing lists her as emotionally unstable, makes reference to a prior mental health hold that I can't verify because the records are sealed and... He stopped. And it was filed by Dr. Colfax Harn. The name landed in the room like something physical. Dominic set the encrypted drive on the table between them. He knows we have her. He knows you found her. Garrett looked at the drive. He's trying to get ahead of it. If she's officially flagged as unstable before she can give a statement, everything she says becomes compromised, Dominic finished. Garrett nodded. He's not done. This is just the first move. Down the hallway, behind the break room door, Elena Voss lay stabilized and alive. A woman who had survived 2 gunshots, an ambush designed to kill her, and 11 years of being exactly what the people around her failed to see. And Dr. Colfax Harn, the man who had ordered her death, was already building the story that would bury her. He had no idea what she had already built against him, or what was coming. He had no idea what she had already built against him, or what was coming. Dominic picked up the encrypted drive and turned it over in his palm once before setting it back down. The plastic casing was warm from his pocket, something that small, containing something that could dismantle a man who had spent 11 years building himself into a position of institutional trust. It was the kind of object that didn't look like anything until it did. We need to move her, he said. Garrett shook his head. Max said 48 hours. Max said 48 hours before we transport her somewhere with imaging. She didn't say 48 hours before Harn finds this location. Dominic looked at the door. He filed that missing persons report inside 20 minutes of me leaving the overpass. That's not a man guessing. That's a man with information. Garrett was quiet. Then, you think he has someone inside PD? I think he designed a system that required protecting for 11 years, and I think he's been careful about every piece of it, including this one. Dominic picked up his jacket. How exposed is this location? It's logged as a secondary substation. Anyone with access to facility records? How long do we have? Garrett checked his watch. It was 5:44 a.m. If he made contact inside PD when he filed that report, maybe 2 hours. Maybe less. 2 hours. Dominic went back down the hallway. Elena was awake. She'd pulled herself to a sitting position on the cot despite the IV line and the bandaging, and she was looking at the door when he pushed it open, which meant she'd heard enough of the conversation to know what was happening before he said a word. He filed the report, she said. Mental health history, sealed records, emotional instability. He crossed to the chair and sat. He's trying to build a wall between you and any statement you give. The sealed records are fabricated. Her voice was flat. He created them. I don't have a mental health hold. I've never had a mental health hold. She said it without heat. just the fatigue of having to say it at all. It's a protocol. If a witness becomes inconvenient, you create a record that makes their testimony questionable before they give it. It's... She stopped. I've seen it used before. Not in a hospital. In a different context. Dominic looked at her. Military? Intelligence-adjacent operation. Someone flagged a procurement irregularity. 2 weeks later, there was a fitness for duty inquiry with documentation that nobody could verify. She looked at the IV line. The person withdrew the report. That was the point. You didn't withdraw yours. I didn't file mine yet. She looked up. That's probably the only reason I'm still here to have this conversation. He told her about the drive. He set it on the cot beside her hand, and she looked at it for a moment without touching it, and something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like a tension that had been held in reserve finally being applied somewhere useful. The encryption key is a 12-digit sequence, she said. I'm not giving it to you yet. I'm not asking for it. I know. She met his eyes. But I need you to understand that the drive is the only thing that makes this real. Without it, I'm a wounded nurse with a grudge and a story. With it, Colfax Harn is a man with 11 years of documented fraud, federal-level supply diversion, and a direct communication trail connecting him to the people who shot me. She picked up the drive and closed her fist around it. I'm not handing that to anyone until I'm in front of someone I can verify. Garrett Poole is taking this to the Federal Financial Crimes Desk when the office opens. Garrett Poole, she repeated. Is he the kind of detective who goes where the evidence leads? Or the kind who goes where it's comfortable? Dominic thought about that honestly. He's gone somewhere uncomfortable before, he said. He's also careful. Sometimes careful looks like slow. We don't have time for slow. No, he agreed. We don't. She handed the drive back to him. Keep it with you, not in this building. She leaned back against the wall behind the cot. And we need to move within 90 minutes. I can travel if Max secures the bandaging properly. She's still here. Good. Get her. Dr. Adira Mack resecured the dressings at 6:10 a.m. with the resignation of someone who had stopped arguing about things she couldn't control and started managing outcomes instead. She wrapped the lower wound tightly, hung a portable IV bag from a clip above the cot, and told Elena in precise terms what would happen to her if she moved wrong, which rib would shift, what it would feel like, and how much warning she'd get before it became a genuine emergency. Elena listened without interrupting and said, "Understood," when Mac finished, and Mac looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone realizing they'd overprepared for the wrong kind of patient. They moved Elena to Garrett's personal vehicle at 6:23 a.m. She walked to the car herself, slowly and with her hand braced against the hallway wall, but she walked. Dominic watched her do it and kept the thought he had to himself. Garrett drove. Dominic sat in the back with Elena. They took surface streets east toward the Halford district, where Garrett had a contact, a retired federal prosecutor named Sylvia Rourke, who had a house on Denbier Lane and had, according to Garrett, agreed to this without requiring much explanation because she was the kind of person who operated on trust built over decades and asked questions later. Elena watched the city move past the window. Cairo City at 6:30 in the morning was all delivery trucks and early commuters and the particular gray-gold light that came before full sunrise, when everything looked provisional. She hadn't said anything since they'd left the substation. Dominic let the silence sit for a few blocks. Then he said, "When you recognized the dispatch coding structure, the communication signature from your deployment, how certain were you?" She didn't look away from the window. "Certain enough to start a file, but certain enough to stake your life on it." "I didn't stake my life on it intentionally." A pause. "I staked my career on it. My life was staked by someone else." He accepted that. "What was the operation? The one where you first saw the sequencing?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "Forward operating position, third deployment. We were supporting a medical evaluation unit embedded with a joint task force. There were supply irregularities coming out of a logistics contractor attached to the operation, pharmaceutical inventory, controlled substances, equipment that was being logged as combat loss but was actually being redirected." She turned from the window. "Someone in the unit flagged it. The investigation was opened and then quietly closed. The contractor was eventually replaced, not prosecuted. Nobody ever said why." "But you remembered the coding." I remember everything that doesn't make sense, she said. It's a habit. Garrett's eyes moved to the rearview mirror briefly. He didn't say anything. Sylvia Rourke was 63, short, and moved through her own kitchen with the energy of someone who had long since stopped caring what she looked like to other people before 7 a.m. She put coffee on without being asked, looked at Elena with the assessing eye of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between people who said they had evidence and people who actually did, and said, "Sit down before you fall down." Elena sat. Sylvia listened to everything. She asked 3 questions during Dominic's account, 2 during Garrett's, and none during Elena's. She just listened with her coffee cup in both hands and her eyes on Elena's face. And when Elena finished, Sylvia set the cup down and said, "Colfax Harn." "You know him?" Dominic asked. "I know Hargrove Regional. I sat on a state oversight panel review of their administrative structure 4 years ago." She stood and moved to the counter. Harn gave testimony. "I thought he was thorough. I thought he was organized." She turned. "I also thought the panel's questions were soft, but I was the outside reviewer and I wasn't running it." "Could the panel have missed what Elena documented?" Garrett asked. "If the documentation pattern was as disciplined as she's describing, yes, easily." Sylvia looked at Elena. "You said the coding structure matched something from a military operation. Same sequencing logic, different implementation. Which means whoever built it either served or was trained by someone who did." "Yes." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "Harn's background. Do either of you know it?" Dominic shook his head. "I'll find out," Garrett said. "Find out before you go to the federal desk." Sylvia refilled her cup. "Because if he has a military or intelligence-adjacent background, and you walk into that building without knowing it, you'll tip someone off before you have your case properly secured." She looked at Garrett directly. "Who are you going to?" "Agent Patricia Weld, Financial Crimes Unit. I've worked with her on 2 prior referrals." Sylvia nodded slowly. "I know Weld, she's good. She's also by the book, which means she's going to want the documentation before she moves, not after." She turned to Elena. "The drive." "It's encrypted," Elena said. "Can you provide the key to Weld directly, in a verified setting, with Garrett present?" "Yes." "Then that's the sequence." Sylvia looked between the 3 of them. "But you need to move on that today, because Harn is already building the counter-narrative, and every hour you wait is another hour he's using." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the city had brightened from provisional gray to genuine morning, and somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing in particular. Dominic drank his coffee and thought about an emergency services director arriving at Hargrove Regional for his morning shift, aware that his hired job had failed and that a nurse he'd tried to bury was alive somewhere with evidence in her hand. He thought about what a man like that did next. What Colfax Harn did next became clear at 8:17 a.m. when Garrett's phone rang. It was his contact inside Cairo City PD, a records clerk named Jessamine, who owed Garrett nothing but chose to call anyway because she had been watching the internal system all morning and something about the activity pattern bothered her. She said, in a voice just above a whisper, "Someone put a flag on Officer Dominic Rail's personal vehicle. Unauthorized departure from shift perimeter. Active investigation obstruction." The request came from outside the department. It was approved by Captain Louis Farron. Garrett set the phone down on Sylvia's kitchen table and looked at Dominic. "Farron," Dominic said. "You know him?" "I've met him twice. Department liaison for external requests. He processes interagency communications." Dominic kept his voice even. "If Harn has a line inside PD, it goes through Farron." "You're flagged," Garrett said, "which means your vehicle is being tracked and your badge access may be suspended within the hour." Dominic leaned forward and set his coffee cup down carefully. He was thinking about something Harn's text message had said. "Return the nurse and the drive before 8 a.m. or this gets worse for both of you." It was 8:17. The escalation was punctual. "He's trying to isolate us," Elena said from across the table. She'd been quiet for the past 20 minutes, but she'd been listening. "If your access is flagged, and Garrett goes to Weld without verified law enforcement standing, the referral is compromised." "I have standing," Garrett said. "Financial crimes detective, active, with an investigation that isn't officially open," she said, "and a flagged patrol officer who transported a missing persons subject without authorization." She looked at Dominic. He's not trying to stop us. He's trying to make us look like the problem before we can make him look like one. Then we need to get to Weld before Farron gets to anyone else, Garrett said. You need more than Weld, Sylvia said. She had been standing at the counter with her second cup of coffee, watching all three of them with the patience of someone who had seen faster situations move slower. You need someone who can neutralize the missing persons flag on Elena and the flag on Dominic simultaneously, before Harn has time to build any more walls. Who does that? Dominic asked. Sylvia set her cup down. A federal contact with enough standing to supersede local PD flags on an active federal matter. She looked at Garrett. Do you have someone above Weld, someone who can open the umbrella fast? Garrett thought. Deputy Director of Field Operations for this region. His name is Samuel Okafor. I've never worked directly with him, but I have a reference contact who has. Call the reference contact, now. Sylvia looked at Elena. And you need to be visible. Not physically. You can't be moved safely yet. But your testimony needs to begin being documented in a form that creates a legal record independent of what Harn is building. She crossed to the kitchen desk and pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer. Start writing everything, dates, chart references, the dispatch codes, the van trade connection, the ambush sequence. In your own words, your own hand. She set the pad in front of Elena and set a pen on top of it. If anything happens to you before you can testify, that document survives. Elena looked at the legal pad for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and started writing. Garrett's call to his reference contact reached a federal duty officer at 8:54 a.m. The reference itself, a senior investigator named Paulin, who had worked 3 joint operations with Garrett, was reachable by 9/11. Paulin listened, said very little, and told Garrett he would contact Samuel Okafor directly and that Garrett should expect a callback within the hour. The callback came in 47 minutes. Dominic heard Garrett's side of it from across the living room. Garrett said yes 3 times, gave the address of the substation by habit, and then corrected to Sylvia's address, said Elena Voss's name in full, said the name Colfax Harn, spelled it, said Van Trade Solutions, said the name Captain Louis Farron, and then said, yes, sir. We can have her ready. He ended the call and looked at Dominic. Okafor is sending 2 federal agents. They'll be here in 2 hours. Garrett exhaled slowly. He's flagging the investigation as a federal matter as of this morning, which supersedes the missing persons report and the flag on your vehicle. Dominic felt something release in his chest. Not relief, just the absence of a pressure that had been building since 2:19 a.m. Farron? Okafor said that's being handled separately. Garrett's voice was careful. He didn't say more than that. They went back to the kitchen. Elena was still writing. She had filled 3 pages of the legal pad in a handwriting that was small and extremely even, line after line, no corrections visible. Sylvia was reading the pages as they were completed, her face doing the thing it did when she was cataloging rather than reacting. Elena, Dominic said. She kept writing. I heard. Federal agents, 2 hours. I know. She turned a page. I need to finish this. He sat across from her and watched her write. It was a strange thing to watch, someone reconstructing, from memory, a pattern of concealment that a man had spent years building, page by page in a kitchen in the Halford district, while the city moved through its morning outside the window. Her handwriting didn't change pace or pressure. Her wrist moved steadily. Whatever she was feeling about the night that had happened to her, it was underneath the work, not on top of it. At 11:03 a.m., the 2 federal agents arrived. Their names were Ferris and Odom. They wore plain clothes and drove an unmarked vehicle and presented credentials to Sylvia at the door before entering, which Sylvia examined properly before stepping aside. They were polite, efficient, and they shook hands with everyone in the room before sitting down at the kitchen table. Agent Ferris was the one who spoke first. She looked at Elena's legal pad, at the encrypted drive on the table, and said, Ms. Voss, we've been briefed by Deputy Director Okafor. We'd like to hear everything directly from you. Take whatever time you need. Elena put the pen down. She had filled 9 pages. I don't need time, she said. I need you to verify your credentials against the federal database before I give you the encryption key, and I need a documented chain of custody for the drive starting from this moment. Agent Ferris looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Agent Odom. Then she looked back at Elena and said, Absolutely. It took 12 minutes to establish verification to Elena's satisfaction. Dominic watched the process. Elena pulling up the federal directory on Sylvia's laptop, cross-referencing badge numbers, running a callback to the agency duty line, asking Ferris 2 questions that the credentials alone couldn't answer. Ferris answered both without hesitation. Elena gave them the encryption key. What the drive contained took Ferris and Odom 40 minutes to review in summary. They worked quietly at the kitchen table with the laptop between them, and what they found, going by their expressions, which were controlled but not entirely, was apparently more than they had expected to find. At 12:41 p.m., Ferris looked up from the screen and said to Garrett, "When you said supply diversion and falsified dispatch protocols, I had a framework in mind. This is larger." "How much larger?" Garrett asked. "The documentation covers 4 years of inventory manipulation across 3 supply chains, with financial transfers routed through Van Trade Solutions and 2 other shell entities." She set the laptop down. "There are at least 6 physicians implicated in the chart falsification. The controlled substance diversion alone is a federal trafficking charge. The dispatch corruption adds obstruction and conspiracy." She paused. "And there is a direct financial transfer on record, 3 months ago, from an account associated with Van Trade to a personal account belonging to Captain Louis Farron." The kitchen was very quiet. Dominic said nothing. He was thinking about the flag on his vehicle, about the missing persons report, about a dispatch log altered at 2 a.m. to send a nurse to an empty overpass. He was thinking about how many pieces of this Harn had assembled, and how long, and with what patience, and how completely he had expected it all to hold. "Harn," Elena said. "Is his background on record?" Odom looked up. "We pulled it this morning. Prior to Hargrove Regional, he spent 6 years as a logistics coordinator for a defense contracting firm attached to a military medical supply network." He looked at Elena. "Which is why he knew the sequencing. Which is why I recognized it," she said. Odom nodded. "Yes." Elena leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes briefly, not exhaustion or not only exhaustion. The particular expression of someone who had been right about something they had hoped they were wrong about. Ferris closed the laptop. "We need to move quickly. Harn doesn't know what's on that drive. He knows you survived and that we made contact, but as of this morning, he's still operating under the assumption that the missing persons flag and the narrative he's building gives him room to maneuver." She looked at Garrett. "That window closes as soon as we execute the first warrant." "When?" Garrett asked. "Today." Ferris stood. "We're going to need warrants for Hargrove's servers, Harn's administrative files, and Van Trade Solutions financial records. I can have those drafted by 2 p.m. if the U.S. Attorney's Office processes them as emergency priority." "And Harn himself?" Dominic asked. "We'll move on him simultaneously with the server seizure." She picked up the drive and placed it in an evidence bag from her jacket pocket. "The moment he sees federal agents in the building, he's going to know the window has closed. We need to make sure he doesn't have time to do anything about it." Dominic thought about a man watching federal agents walk through his hospital's front doors. He thought about what a man like that did when he realized the system he had built for 11 years was coming apart in a single morning. He thought about Elena's warning from the overpass. He didn't think anyone would find it, and when someone did, he made one phone call. "He's going to run," Dominic said. Ferris looked at him. "Why do you think so?" "Because the phone call he made last night was impulsive. That's not how he operates. The rest of it is too careful, too layered. If he panics, he runs. He's had 11 years to build an exit." Ferris was quiet for a moment. "We'll have eyes on him." "You'll need more than eyes," she looked at him steadily. "Mr. Rael, we've done this before." He let it go. He didn't fully believe it, but he let it go. At 1:14 p.m., Ferris and Odom left with the drive and Elena's 9-page handwritten statement. The kitchen felt larger and quieter after they went. Sylvia made more coffee. Garrett sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug and the look of a man recalibrating. Elena was still at the table. She was looking at the legal pad, at the empty pages left after the 9 filled ones, and her expression was the particular kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. "You should rest," Dominic said. "In a minute." She didn't move. "The 2 people who shot me. Have you? Not yet. It was on the list." "They'll go to ground," she said. "If Harn knows the federal clock is running, he'll cut every loose end he can reach before they get to him." She looked up. "Those 2 are loose ends." He hadn't let himself think about that directly, and he didn't like the fact that she'd gotten there before he had. "I'll call Odom," he said. Do it now, he called. Odom picked up on the second ring and said they were already working it and gave nothing else. Dominic relayed this to Elena, who nodded once in a way that said she understood the translation. We know. We're not telling you how far along we are. She leaned her head back against the chair. She was pale, and the lines around her eyes were deep, and she looked like someone who had spent the last 12 hours running on something that wasn't sustainable and knew it. Elena, she opened her eyes. You did this right, he said. The documentation, the dispatch flag, the way you managed the overpass, all of it. She was quiet for a moment, then, I almost didn't get out of the ambulance in time. But you did. Because I hesitated on the wrong side of the calculation. She looked at him. I should have left earlier. I knew the call felt wrong. I went anyway because I thought... She stopped. I thought maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't there. I thought maybe I'd spent too long looking for operational irregularities and started manufacturing them. You weren't. No. She turned to look at the window. But the fact that I doubted myself long enough to drive to an overpass at 2 a.m., that's not a good outcome. That's a mistake I survived. He had no useful response to that. He sat with it, which felt like the correct thing to do. Outside Sylvia's front window, a Cairo City patrol car moved slowly down Denby Lane, and for a fraction of a second both of them watched it pass without speaking. It kept going. Nothing in its movement suggested anything directed, but Dominic's phone lit up on the table between them with a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was speaking in the controlled, rapid cadence of someone relaying information that couldn't wait. Agent Ferris, calling from a different line, saying that federal warrants had been expedited and that teams were moving on Hargrove Regional and the Van Trade Solutions office simultaneously, and that Dr. Colfax Harn had not been at the hospital when they arrived. His office was empty, his personal vehicle was gone from the staff parking lot, and the security footage from the executive corridor had a 16-minute gap beginning at 12:58 p.m., 7 minutes after Ferris and Odom had left Sylvia's address. Someone had told him they were coming. Someone had told him they were coming. Dominic stayed on the line with Ferris long enough to confirm the timeline. Harn's vehicle left the executive parking structure at 1:02 p.m. The security gap began at 12:58. The gap wasn't accidental, and it wasn't a system failure. It was a 4-minute window, precisely opened and precisely closed, the kind of thing that required both access and foreknowledge. How many people knew your timeline this morning? Dominic asked. Ferris's pause was short but present. Our team, Okafor's office, and the U.S. Attorney's duty clerk who processed the warrants. That's not a small number. No, she said. It's not. Another pause. Stay where you are. We have units on every major exit corridor out of Cairo City. His vehicle is flagged. He's been careful for 11 years, Dominic said. He's not driving his own car. Ferris ended the call without responding to that, which told him she agreed with it. He set the phone down. Garrett was already looking at him from across the table, and Sylvia had stopped pretending to read the newspaper she'd picked up 20 minutes ago. He's gone, Elena said. She hadn't moved from her chair, but her eyes were sharp and she was already working it. What vehicle would he have access to? Secondary personal, hospital fleet, something connected to Van Trade? Van Trade's fleet is being pulled in the warrant, Garrett said. If he knew the warrant was coming, he knew that too. She shifted, winced, held it. He won't use anything traceable. He'll use something borrowed. Someone inside the network who isn't named in the filing. We don't have that list yet, Dominic said. Then we need to think about where he goes. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table, steadying herself. A man who's been running a protected network for 11 years doesn't build one exit. He builds 3. The question is which one he thinks is still clean. Garrett pulled out his notebook. Old habit. Property records. Van Trade, associated entities. If he has a safe house or a secondary location, that takes time. I know. Sylvia set the newspaper down. Colfax Harn's testimony to the oversight panel 4 years ago included a personal disclosure form. He listed a secondary property, a cabin property, I believe, on a lake outside the city. I remember because I flagged it as potentially relevant to his consulting work and then was told it wasn't within scope. She looked at Garrett. I kept my notes. She left the kitchen. She came back in 4 minutes with a manila folder that had the pressed look of something stored properly for a long time. She opened it on the table, found the page, and pointed. The The property address was there. Rural route, Kellaway Lake, 43 miles northeast of Cairo City. Garrett took a photo of it with his phone. He was already dialing Ferris before he stood up. Ferris redirected a state police unit toward the Kellaway Lake property within 8 minutes of Garrett's call. She told him they'd have visual confirmation within 45 and that he should stay on standby. She did not invite him to participate, which Garrett noted without comment. What happened in the next hour inside Sylvia's kitchen was the particular kind of waiting that felt like action because there was nothing else available. Garrett worked his phone in the living room, pulling background on Van Trade's secondary entities, looking for names that might correspond to the unidentified contact inside PD or the U.S. Attorney's Office. Sylvia made food that nobody really wanted and set it on the table anyway, because it was something concrete to do with her hands. Dominic sat with Elena. She was worse than she'd been 2 hours ago, not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately visible, but he'd been watching her closely enough to see the signs. The color had left her face in the gradual way that meant internal processes were working harder than they should. She was breathing shallower. She hadn't acknowledged it. "You need imaging," he said. "I know." Max said I know what Max said. She looked at him. "And I know what I feel. I'm not going to a hospital until Harn is contained. If he still has a contact inside Hargrove's admin network, and I walk into an emergency room, that contact knows. We can use Marvel General, or Dominic." She said his name for the first time, and the flatness of it stopped him. "I've managed worse than this. I need 2 more hours. After Kellaway confirms, I'll let Mac take me to Marvel." She held his gaze. 2 hours. He didn't agree out loud, but he stopped pushing. She leaned back and closed her eyes, and he watched her regulate her breathing, slow, deliberate, the same controlled pattern she'd under the overpass. It was a technique. He recognized that now. She wasn't resting. She was managing. At 2:17 p.m., Garrett came back to the kitchen doorway. His face told Dominic before the words did. "Kellaway came back clear," Garrett said. "Cabin's empty. No vehicle, no sign of recent occupation. Neighbor says they haven't seen anyone there in 3 weeks." Elena opened her eyes. "He went somewhere else," she said. "Or he's still moving," Garrett said. "State police have checkpoints on the 2 main corridors. If he's on the road," "He's not on the road," she said. "Not anymore." She sat forward slowly, hand pressing against her left side. "He's had since 1 p.m. He's where he's going." She looked at Dominic. "Think about the network. Not Harn's exits. The network's exits. Who does he trust enough to shelter him that isn't in any of the documentation?" The question landed and sat there. Dominic turned it over. Harn's network, as Elena had documented it, ran through Hargrove Regional and Van Trade Solutions and the 6 implicated physicians and Captain Farron inside PD. Every named piece of it was now under federal lens, but Elena's documentation covered what she could see from the inside of a trauma unit. It didn't cover everything. "The defense contractor," he said. "The logistics firm he worked for before Hargrove." Elena pointed at him once. "Yes." Garrett was already moving back to the living room. "What?" The firm was named Portwell Integrated Systems. It had supplied medical logistics to military contracting operations for 14 years, with offices in 3 states. Its connection to Harn was public. He'd listed it on his disclosure form. But its connection to Van Trade Solutions was not, until Garrett found a financial filing from 18 months prior that showed a shared registered agent between a Portwell subsidiary and one of Van Trade's shell entities. He brought the filing to Dominic, who brought it to Ferris by phone. Ferris said she'd have someone on Portwell's Cairo City office within the hour. It was 3:09 p.m. The hour they were waiting for turned into 90 minutes. During that time, Dr. Mack returned to Sylvia's house. Garrett had called her, quietly, at Dominic's request, and examined Elena without being invited to do so, which Elena permitted with the air of someone accepting a necessary inconvenience. Mack checked the lower dressing, asked 3 clinical questions, listened to Elena's answers, and then sat back and said, "The rib hasn't shifted, but you're holding tension through your left side in a way that's going to create a secondary problem if you don't decompress it. You need to stop being vertical." "I'm in a chair." Stop being alert." Mac looked at her steadily. 20 minutes. Horizontal. Eyes closed. "I don't mean sleep. Stop running your nervous system at full capacity for 20 minutes because it is burning through your clotting reserves." Elena looked at Dominic. "Don't look at me," he said. She looked back at Mac. 20 minutes. Mac set a timer. Elena moved to the living room couch, lay down with the careful precision of someone mapping exactly how much movement each injury would permit, and was horizontal and still within 30 seconds. Dominic stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the timer on Mac's phone count down and thought about how strange it was that the most tactically disciplined person in the building had needed a trauma surgeon to tell her to stop moving. The timer reached 0 at 3:41 p.m. Ferris called at 3:43. Dominic answered before the second ring and stepped out the kitchen door into Sylvia's small backyard. Dry grass, a bird bath with no water in it, the distant hum of the city beyond the fence line. "Portwell's office was a dead end," Ferris said, "but we found the vehicle." She paused. "Abandoned at the transit hub on Caro South, level 4 of the parking structure. It's a Portwell fleet vehicle registered to a subsidiary, gray panel van, reported stolen from the Portwell yard 2 days ago." 2 days ago, Dominic repeated. "He planned this before last night." "He planned this before I ever found her." He stood very still. "What's at the transit hub?" "Bus terminal, light rail connection, and a regional airport shuttle that runs direct to Harkin Regional Airport, 40 miles east." Her voice was clipped. "The shuttle runs every 40 minutes. Last departure was 3:20. We have agents at Harkin now." "Does Harkin have outbound international connections?" "One. Connecting flight through a hub in..." She stopped. There was a sound in the background that Dominic couldn't identify. Then, "Stand by." He stood by for 90 seconds. The city hummed. A bird landed on the empty bird bath and looked at him. Ferris came back. "He's not at Harkin. We have the shuttle manifest. He's not on it. We're pulling the terminal footage now." "He changed direction," Dominic said. "The transit hub was a redirect. He wanted you looking at the airport." Silence on the line. Then quietly, "Yes." "He knows your playbook," Dominic said. "Whoever told him you were coming this morning knows enough about your operational procedures to tell him how to run from you." He kept his voice even. "You have an active leak, not a small one." Another silence. Longer. "I know," Ferris said. She ended the call. Dominic stood in the backyard for a minute before going back inside. He needed the 60 seconds. He needed the dry grass and the empty bird bath and the city hum to give him something to stand on that wasn't moving. Harn had been planning his exit for at least 2 days, which meant he had suspected exposure before Elena was shot, or he had contingency exits built as a matter of standing practice, which was worse in a different way. He had a contact with enough knowledge of federal operational procedure to tell him specifically how they would move and where they would look. And he was now somewhere in the region with a head start of nearly 3 hours and a network of people whose names were not on any document Elena had been able to access. Dominic went back inside. Elena was sitting up on the couch. She had heard enough from the doorway. "The airport redirect," she said. "Yes." "Classic. Force federal resources toward a predicted exit point while you use an unpredicted one." She stood, slowly, one hand on the couch arm. "What's between Caro City and the eastern border? Not the main corridor, the secondary routes." Garrett pulled up a map on his phone and brought it to the coffee table. They stood over it, Elena, Dominic, Garrett, and Sylvia, who had appeared in the doorway without announcing herself. "Kellaway Lake is here," Elena said, touching the screen. "He didn't go there, but it's on the route to something else." She traced her finger northeast, past the lake, past the state forest boundary. "What's out here?" "Private airstrips," Sylvia said from the doorway. Everyone looked at her. "I'm not speculating. Portwell Integrated Systems held a logistics contract with a private aviation company that operated in this region. It was in the panel disclosure documents. I didn't know it was relevant at the time." She came into the room. The aviation company was called Narwell Flight Services. They operated a private strip outside a town called Delacroft. That's... She pointed to the map. "There. 61 miles northeast." Elena looked at the map for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Dominic. "How fast can you get Ferris to redirect?" "Fast, but if she's the leak..." "She's not." Elena's voice was certain. "The leak is above her. Someone in Okafor's office or the U.S. Attorney's duty chain saw the warrant request and made a call. Ferris is clean." She held his gaze. "Call her, but route it through Okafor directly. not through Ferris's normal channel. If the leak is in the duty chain, Okafor calling direct cuts around it. Dominic pulled out his phone. He didn't have Okafor's number directly. He looked at Garrett. Paulin, Garrett said. He was already dialing. It took 4 minutes to get Paulin and another 2 to get Okafor. Dominic talked fast and precise. The Portwell Aviation Connection, Narwhal Flight Services, the Delacroft Strip, the 2-day preparation window, the airport redirect is misdirection. Okafor listened without interrupting. When Dominic finished, Okafor said, "You're confident about the private strip." "I'm confident about the connection. I can't confirm he's there." 61 miles. If he left the transit hub by 1:15, he had time. "All right." Okafor's voice was measured. "I'm redirecting directly, not through the standard channel." A pause. "Mr. Rael, the contact who flagged your vehicle this morning, we've traced it. The authorization came from Captain Farron, but the instruction originated from a financial crimes duty clerk who processed the warrant this morning. The leak. Being addressed." His voice was very flat when he said it. "You'll hear from my team when we have eyes on Delacroft." They heard at 5:02 p.m., not from Okafor. From Ferris, who had been redirected through Okafor's direct channel, and who called Garrett's phone because Dominic's number had been flagged in the system, and she wasn't certain it was clean. "We have visual on a vehicle matching a Portwell subsidiary registration at the Delacroft airstrip," she said. "The strip has one aircraft on the ground, a Cessna registered to Narwhal Flight Services. We have confirmation from FAA that a flight plan was filed 40 minutes ago for a route that connects to a private strip across the state border." "Is he in the aircraft?" Garrett asked. "We have a male figure in the terminal building. We can't confirm identity at this distance." She paused. "We're moving in 8 minutes. Ground team plus air support. I need Elena Voss available for a video identification call within the next 20 minutes. Garrett looked at Elena across the room. "Yes," Elena said. She hadn't heard the call, but she'd seen his face. "She's available," Garrett said. Ferris ended the call. Elena was already standing. She was pale and she was breathing with the careful deliberateness that Dominic now recognized as her managing something she wasn't going to name, and she held out her hand for Garrett's phone. "Walk me through what you need me to do," she said. Garrett talked her through the identification protocol. The call would come in, they'd route live footage, she'd need to verbally confirm identity with a documented witness present. Sylvia volunteered to be the witness. Elena nodded through all of it without interrupting. At 5:19 p.m., Garrett's phone rang. The image that came through was grainy, drone footage from altitude, thermal overlay, a figure moving through a small terminal building toward a door that led onto the airstrip. The figure was male, medium build, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had a destination and had decided not to run toward it. Elena watched the screen. She watched the figure for 11 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "That's him. That's Colfax Harn." Ferris confirmed on the line. "All units, we have identification confirmed. Move in." What happened on the screen over the next 4 minutes was not smooth or cinematic. It was loud even through the phone's small speaker. Radio chatter, the ground team's approach calls, a brief moment when the figure on the screen became aware of the vehicles converging and stopped walking and stood very still in the middle of the airstrip with nowhere to go that wasn't already covered. Harn didn't run. He stood on the tarmac of a private airstrip 61 miles from the city he had operated in for 11 years. And the federal agents who reached him first had their credentials out before they had their hands on him, because that was protocol, and protocol was the thing he had always counted on to protect him. This time, it was the thing closing around him. "He's in custody," Ferris said. Elena handed the phone back to Garrett. She walked to the kitchen, not fast, and she stood at the sink with her back to the room for a long moment. Dominic didn't follow her immediately. He gave it 30 seconds. When he came to the doorway, she was looking out the small window above the sink at Sylvia's dry backyard. Her shoulders were level. Her breathing was controlled. She looked like someone who had just set down something very heavy and was waiting to see if she remembered how to stand without it. "It's not over," she said without turning around. "Farron is still out. The 2 who shot me. They'll move on Farron now that Harn is contained," Dominic said. "The shooters are in the network. Harn in custody gives leverage." "I know." She turned around. Her face was tired in a way that went past the physical. "I know how it works." He looked at her. "Marvel General. Now." She didn't argue, which told him more than arguing would have. He got her jacket from the chair back. He helped her into it with the practiced impersonality of someone who had done medical assists before and knew the difference between helping and hovering. She let him. They were almost to the front door when Dominic's phone buzzed. Not a call, a text, from a number he didn't recognize, the same format as the one from the night before. He read it. He stopped walking. Elena saw his face. What? He turned the phone so she could read the message. She identified the wrong man, checked the footage timestamp. Harn was at Portwell's Caro office at 5:02 p.m. We have him on camera. The man on that airstrip is not Colfax Harn. Elena read it twice. Her expression didn't change on the surface. Underneath it, something recalculated its speed. The footage they sent me, she said. Thermal overlay. I couldn't see his face clearly. I identified build and movement pattern. She looked at Dominic. What if it was staged? Why would... Because he's still running, she said. The airstrip was the redirect. The airport was the cover for the redirect. And the man on that airstrip was... She stopped. He bought himself more time. Dominic was already calling Ferris. Ferris picked up mid-ring. Before he could speak, she said, We have a problem. The man in custody is a Portwell employee named Marcus Webb. He's not Harn. Harn has a documented alibi at the Portwell Caro office through 5:15 p.m. Dominic stood in Sylvia's hallway with the phone at his ear and felt the ground shift under everything they'd built in the past 12 hours. Where is he? He said. We don't know, Ferris said. He's had 4 hours we weren't watching. He could be anywhere. Dominic lowered the phone. Elena was looking at him with the expression of someone who had been right about something she'd hoped she was wrong about, again, and who was already 3 steps ahead of where they were standing. He planned for us finding the drive, she said quietly. He planned for the federal warrant. He planned for the airport, and Kellaway, and the transit hub. She held Dominic's gaze. He planned for me surviving. Elena, this isn't over because he's still free, and the only person who can walk federal investigators through the full operational structure of what he built, she stopped, is me, which means I'm still the problem he needs to solve. The front door of Sylvia's house was 12 feet away. Outside it, Denby Lane sat quiet in the late afternoon, ordinary and still, and somewhere beyond the ordinary stillness of it, Colfax Harn was moving through a city that didn't know his name, toward a destination none of them had predicted, with 4 hours of clean space between himself and every eye that was looking for him. And his phone, which Ferris had just confirmed was last pinged from a cell tower 2 miles from Sylvia Rourke's address on Denby Lane, had gone dark 11 minutes ago. And his phone, which Ferris had just confirmed was last pinged from a cell tower 2 miles from Sylvia Rourke's address on Denby Lane, had gone dark 11 minutes ago. Dominic moved first. He didn't deliberate. He went to the front window, stayed to the side of the frame, and looked out at Denby Lane without exposing himself to the sightline from the street. The lane was quiet. 2 parked cars on the opposite side that hadn't been there when they'd arrived, but residential streets accumulated parked cars throughout the day, and that meant nothing by itself. A woman walking a small dog toward the corner, a delivery truck idling 2 houses down. The delivery truck had been idling for 11 minutes at minimum. Back door, Dominic said. Now. Now. All of you. Sylvia didn't ask questions. She went to the kitchen and unlocked the back door, and Garrett was already moving Elena toward it with one hand on her arm. Not rough, but not gentle either. The grip of someone prioritizing speed over comfort. Elena moved without being told twice. Whatever pain the movement cost her was being managed internally, and she managed it. Dominic kept his eyes on the street through the window. The delivery truck didn't move. He pulled back and followed them through the kitchen, out the back door, into the dry yard. The yard backed onto a narrow service alley that ran parallel to Denby Lane. They went through the gate single file. Sylvia first because she knew the neighborhood, Elena second with Garrett at her side, Dominic last, pulling the gate closed behind him. He called Ferris walking. 2 miles from this location, he said, keeping his voice low. How long ago did the ping register? 11 minutes before I told you, so 22 minutes total. There's a delivery truck that's been stationary on Denby Lane since at least before your call. He has eyes on this location. Ferris didn't hesitate. Get out of the house. I'm sending units. We're already out. We need a secondary rally point, somewhere not in any database connected to anyone in this situation. A pause. There's a federal satellite office on Comstock Avenue. Unmarked building, not logged in any local PD system. I'll send you the address. Do it. He pocketed the phone and caught up to the others at the end of the alley, where it opened onto a side street 2 blocks removed from Denby. Sylvia had flagged a passing cab, old habit from a life before everyone used their phones for everything, and it had pulled over with the mild surprise of a driver who hadn't been hailed by hand signal in a while. They got Elena in first. Garrett and Sylvia followed. Dominic got in last, gave the driver an address 3 blocks from the one Ferris had sent, and they pulled away from the curb at a pace that looked like nothing at all. Elena was breathing in short, measured pulls through her nose. The cab's back seat wasn't designed for someone managing a fractured rib and 2 wound sites, and the positioning showed in the set of her jaw. She didn't say anything about it. "He was watching the house," she said. Statement, not question. "The truck," Dominic said, 2 blocks down. How long had he been out there? "Can't know. Long enough." She was quiet for a moment. "He's not trying to run anymore. He had an exit, and we collapsed it, and now he's—" She stopped. "He's doing what I would do, eliminating the problem directly." "You're the problem," Garrett said. "The drive is the problem. I'm attached to it." She pressed 2 fingers lightly against her left side, testing something, and her expression gave away the result. "The 9-page statement is with Ferris. The drive is in federal custody. I'm the only piece of this that's still accessible." "He can't get to you inside a federal building," Dominic said. "No." She looked at him. "But he can get to the case if he gets to me before I give formal testimony on the record. Everything I've built is documented, but the interpretation, the operational structure, the way the supply chain connected to the dispatch system, the military communication signature, that needs my voice to hold together in a prosecution." "Then we get you in front of a camera and a court reporter today," Garrett said. "That's what he's trying to prevent." The cab moved through afternoon traffic. Outside the windows, Cairo City continued at its normal pace. People on sidewalks, a school bus stopped at a corner. The ordinary texture of a city that had no idea a man with 11 years of carefully constructed protection was moving through it, trying to reach a nurse who had documented his entire operation from a trauma unit on the 4th floor of a hospital he thought he controlled. The federal satellite office on Comstock Avenue looked like an insurance company from the outside, which was the point. Frosted glass, a modest lobby, no signage that meant anything to someone who wasn't looking for it. Ferris met them at the service entrance with 2 agents Dominic hadn't seen before, and a medical kit that was better stocked than anything they'd had at Sylvia's house. She looked at Elena and said, "You need a hospital." "After testimony," Elena said. Ferris looked at Dominic. He gave her the small head movement that meant don't try. She absorbed this and moved on. The room they put Elena in was plain: table, chairs, a wall-mounted camera, recording equipment that looked institutional rather than sophisticated. A woman named Holt, introduced as a federal court reporter, was already seated at the far end of the table with a steno machine that belonged to an era before voice recording made them redundant, and which apparently certain federal proceedings still required. Garrett stayed outside with Sylvia. Dominic sat against the wall while Ferris ran the formal identification and case prefacing. Elena sat at the table and looked at the camera and gave her name and the date and her professional credentials without prompting, and then she began talking. She talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. What came out of her in that room was not the version of events that had been assembled piece by piece across the previous 14 hours. The fractured, urgent, working in the dark reconstruction that had moved them from the overpass to Sylvia's kitchen, to the alley, to here. This was the version she had been building for 3 months inside a trauma unit, quietly, on her own time, in the particular way that someone who has been trained to identify compromised operations and document them with precision actually does it. She had dates and chart numbers and inventory sequence codes and communication logs. She had the specific pharmaceutical categories being diverted and the quantities and the falsification method used to explain the discrepancy. She had the Van Trade financial trail not as a general observation, but as a specific documented sequence, dates, amounts, account routing numbers she had accessed and memorized, because she did not trust that any record she created on hospital equipment was secure. She had the 2 physicians' names. She had the dispatch alteration method and the 4-digit code suffix that Harn had used to mark falsified emergency calls. She had a timeline showing 31 incidents across 4 years that matched the pattern, with 11 of those incidents traceable to controlled substance categories flagged under federal trafficking statutes. And she had the military communication signature, the specific sequencing logic she had first encountered during her second deployment, the one that had made her look twice at Hargrove Regional's dispatch anomalies in the first place, documented with enough technical specificity that a federal prosecutor could put a communications expert on the stand and have them confirm it independently. Ferris took notes with the focused intensity of someone who had stopped being surprised 30 minutes in and was now simply making sure she didn't miss anything. Agent Odom, who joined them partway through, sat very still. When Elena finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The court reporter's machine went silent. Odom said, "Ms. Voss, how long have you been working on this documentation?" Actively, 11 weeks. Passively, recognizing the anomalies and holding them in memory without formal documentation. 6 months before that. You held the inventory discrepancies in memory for 6 months. I held the pattern. I didn't have context for it yet. She met his eyes. Once I had context, I started the file. Why didn't you report earlier? She looked at him levelly. Because I'd seen what happened when someone reported too early. A pause. I didn't want a sealed record and a withdrawn complaint. I wanted a case. Odom nodded slowly. You built one. Yes, she said. I did. At 7:44 p.m., Ferris received confirmation that federal warrants had been executed on Hargrove Regional's server infrastructure. The emergency services IT team, 3 people who had no idea what was on those servers until that afternoon, had complied without resistance. The servers were now in federal custody, and a digital forensics team was running extraction on the dispatch logs going back 4 years. At 8:01 p.m., Captain Louis Farron was arrested at his home in the Cairo City suburb of Pendle Crossing. He opened the door in a bathrobe and stared at the credentials for a long moment before stepping aside. He did not resist. He did not speak, except to ask if he could call his attorney, which he was told he could do from the federal processing facility. 2 of the 6 implicated physicians were reached at Hargrove Regional during the evening shift. They were escorted out through the administrative corridor rather than the public entrance, which was a courtesy that nobody had extended to Elena when they'd tried to end her life, but which the hospital's attorney had apparently negotiated in exchange for access to the physician's personnel files. The other 4 were reached at their homes or through their attorneys by 9:30 p.m. Dominic watched the updates come in through Ferris's relay, one by one, sitting in the hallway outside the testimony room while Elena finished the formal paperwork phase of her statement. He sat with his back against the wall and his forearms on his knees, and he thought about the night before, the overpass and the strobing lights, and a woman on the ground with a gun pointed at his face. And he thought about how different this looked from the inside of a moment versus the inside of a building where people were quietly and methodically dismantling a structure it had taken 11 years to build. There was no satisfaction in it yet. That would come, or it wouldn't, and he'd learned not to schedule it. Garrett came and sat beside him at 8:15 with 2 coffees from somewhere in the building's back offices. He handed one over without commenting on anything, which was one of the things Dominic valued about him. They sat with it for a while. "Harn," Dominic said. Still nothing. Garrett's voice was flat. They found the watcher on Denby Lane. The truck was registered to a shell entity connected to a van trade subsidiary. Driver is a low-level courier with no apparent knowledge of the broader operation. He was paid to watch the address and send a check-in text every 30 minutes. He sent 4 before we moved. Harn knew we left. Yes. But he doesn't know where we went. Garrett turned the coffee cup in his hands. The courier's texts went to a burner. The burner is off. Harn is receiving information, but he's not transmitting, at least not through anything we can currently locate. He has resources we haven't mapped. Almost certainly. Garrett was quiet. Dom. The leak in the warrant chain, the financial crimes duty clerk. His name is Alderman Price. He's been in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 6 years. Okafor's team ran his financials this afternoon. He paused. Price has received 14 payments from a personal account connected through 3 layers to a van trade subsidiary over the past 2 years. Total amount is just under $90,000. Dominic absorbed this. He's not the only one, Garrett said. Price is the one we found fast because he was in the active chain. But a network like this, Running for 4 years with the level of protection it has more than one price. Meaning Harn has resources inside channels we haven't cleared yet, which means wherever he's going, he may have a path we don't know about. The coffee was bad. Dominic drank it anyway. Elena came out of the testimony room at 8:47 p.m. She looked like someone who had deposited everything she'd been carrying and found that the weight of the absence was its own kind of difficult. Ferris walked out with her, and behind Ferris came Odom, with the expression of a man who had revised his estimate of the situation upward 3 times in one afternoon. "We need to get you to a hospital," Ferris said. "Marvel General. I'm arranging an escort." "All right," Elena said. Dominic stood up. She didn't look at him immediately. She was looking down the hallway at nothing specific, recalibrating, and when she did turn her eyes to him, she said, "The 2 shooters from the overpass." "Not yet," he said. "They're the most immediate risk. If Harn can't reach me directly, he reaches me through them." She said it without urgency, as a clinical observation. "They know Farron's arrested and Harn's running. They're either already gone or they're going to make a move before the window closes." "Ferris has them flagged," Garrett said. "Flagged isn't found." She was right, and everyone in the hallway knew it, and there was nothing immediately actionable about knowing it, which was the part that sat wrong. Ferris's escort to Marvel General was 2 unmarked vehicles, and a plainclothes agent named Sura who sat in Elena's room for the entirety of her admission process and didn't put her phone down once. The ER attending at Marvel took one look at Elena's dressings, looked at Dominic, and said, "Who did this field work?" "Trauma surgeon," Dominic said. The attending made a sound that meant barely adequate, but adequate, and moved on. The imaging confirmed what Dr. Mack had suspected. The 11th rib had a hairline fracture. There was minor inflammation around the lower wound tract consistent with the movement of the past 14 hours, and the shoulder wound was clean and would require monitoring but no surgical intervention. Elena was told she needed 72 hours of genuine rest, not the managed performance version she'd been providing. She agreed with the sincerity of someone who had gotten what they needed and could afford to comply now. Dominic stayed until 11 p.m. He sat in the room's one chair, not talking much, while Garrett made calls from the hallway and the city outside the window went through its late evening rearrangement. At some point, Elena fell asleep between one sentence and the next, which told him more about the cumulative cost of the past 18 hours than anything she'd said. He left her in Sura's care and went back to the federal building on Comstock. The digital forensics team finished their first pass extraction from Hargrove's servers at 2:14 a.m. What they found confirmed everything Elena had documented and extended it in 3 directions she hadn't been able to reach from inside the trauma unit. The first extension was geographic. The supply diversion network wasn't limited to Hargrove Regional. There were communication threads connecting Hargrove's falsified dispatch codes to 2 other regional hospitals in the state, smaller facilities, less prominent, where the inventory discrepancies would be even easier to conceal. Harn had used Hargrove as the hub and the other facilities as distribution points. The controlled substances weren't being stockpiled in one place. They were being moved through a medical system that was spread across 3 counties. The second extension was financial. The Vantrade shell structure was more sophisticated than the documentation on Elena's drive had been able to show. There were 9 entities in the chain, not 3. The final destination of the funds, traced through 6 transaction layers, was an offshore account in a jurisdiction with strong financial privacy protections. The account balance, current as of the previous quarter's filing cycle, was $11 million. The third extension was personnel. The server extraction pulled internal communications between Harn and people inside the network that included names nobody had on any list yet. 2 logistics coordinators at one of the secondary hospitals, a state health department administrator who had apparently reviewed Hargrove's annual compliance filings for 4 consecutive years without finding what Elena had found in 11 weeks, and a name that made Garrett sit forward in his chair at 2:30 a.m. and say quietly, "There it is." The name was Wendell Oakes. Oakes was a senior logistics consultant at Portwell Integrated Systems, the defense contractor where Harn had worked before Hargrove. His name appeared in 43 internal communications over 3 years. His financial connection to the network, when Garrett's contact ran it 90 minutes later, was substantial. He was also, as of a property records search run at 3:15 a.m., the registered owner of a lake property on Senate Lake, not Kellaway Lake, where Harn had sent them before, but Senate Lake, 27 miles further northeast, in a county that hadn't been in any of their mapping. Garrett brought it to Dominic at 3:22 a.m. He set his notebook on the table between them and pointed to the name and the address and said nothing else. Dominic looked at it for 4 seconds. Ferris. She's in the building. Get her. The warrant for Senate Lake cleared through a different duty clerk under Okafor's direct authorization at 4:48 a.m. The ground team moved at 5:15. Ferris coordinated from the federal building, running the operation through a secure line with 2 tactical units, one from the federal field office, one from the state police, who had been staged at a location 12 miles from the Senate Lake property since 4:30. Dominic watched the operation on a monitor in the Comstock building's secondary conference room. The feed came from a helmet camera on the lead agent, and it showed what helmet cameras always showed: the ground in motion, the transition from open to enclosed space, voices on a radio channel that overlapped and corrected and went silent when something required silence. The cabin was occupied. They found Harn in a back room with a go bag he hadn't finished packing and a laptop connected to a satellite hotspot that his people were already working to preserve before he could remote wipe it. He was wearing different clothes than he'd worn to Hargrove that morning. He had not apparently slept. He didn't run. He stood in the cabin's back room and looked at the federal agents in their tactical gear, and his expression on the camera feed was difficult to read. Not quite resignation, not quite the face of a man who hadn't known this was coming. More like someone who had calculated the odds and arrived at this conclusion and was now present for the confirmation of a mathematics he'd already done. He said, "I want my attorney." "You'll have your attorney," the lead agent said. "I want to make a statement first." The lead agent said nothing. Protocol. "I want to say," Harn said, and his voice was steady in a way that took a particular kind of discipline to maintain, "that she found something I didn't think could be found. That matters." He paused. "I want that on record." Nobody responded. The agents moved him to the doorway, and the camera feed shifted, and the feed from the outside unit picked him up, being walked to a vehicle in the early morning gray of Senate Lake's shoreline. And Dominic watched it from a conference room in Cairo City and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. Not triumph, something more complicated. Garrett stood behind him. He watched the feed for a moment and then said, "He's in custody." "Yes." $11 million, 3 counties, 4 years. Garrett exhaled. "She found it in 11 weeks from a trauma unit." "She found it in 6 months, Dominic said. "It took her 11 weeks to document it." Garrett accepted the correction. They watched the vehicle door close on the feed. The morning after moved in the way that mornings after things move, faster and with more paperwork than the night that preceded them. Federal prosecutors were contacted by 7 a.m. The U.S. Attorney's Office began assembling charges: conspiracy, federal trafficking in controlled substances, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, wire fraud, and, for Harn specifically, solicitation of murder in the first degree. Alderman Price was charged separately with bribery and obstruction. Captain Farron's charges included corruption, obstruction, and conspiracy. The 2 physicians still at Hargrove, the 2 who had been the primary chart falsifiers, cooperated within hours of being formally charged, which was what people who had been caught doing exactly what the documentation said they'd done tended to do. Their cooperation added 3 new names to the personnel list and confirmed 2 aspects of the financial structure that the server extraction had found but not fully mapped. Dominic was at Marvel General by 8:30 a.m. He brought coffee from the place on the corner that he'd passed on the drive. He knocked before opening the door. Elena was awake. She was sitting up in the hospital bed with the TV off and her hands in her lap, looking at the window. Agent Sura was in the corner chair, still present, still on her phone. Elena turned when he came in. He handed her the coffee. He sat in the room's second chair and told her everything, in order, without editorializing. Harn's arrest. Oaks. The server extraction. The charges. The scope of what the network had actually covered. 3 counties, 2 secondary hospitals, $11 million. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she held her coffee with both hands and looked at it. "The shooters," she said. "Ferris is running it. With Harn in custody and Price cooperating, she expects names within the day." Elena nodded once. You did it, he said. She looked at him. We. You built the case. I drove the car. You drove the car at 2:19 a.m. to an empty overpass and didn't walk away. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. He didn't argue with it. He drank his coffee and looked at the window and thought about a morning 11 years earlier when he'd first started his shift in Cairo City and told himself he'd make sergeant inside 5 years, and how the city had adjusted those expectations patiently and without apology, the way cities always did. And he thought about how the most significant thing he'd probably ever do in 11 years of patrol had started with ignoring a dying woman's instruction to stay back. Some things only worked out because somebody decided to stop listening. At 10:14 a.m., Elena's attending physician came in for morning rounds and reviewed the overnight monitoring and said the imaging was stable and the inflammation was responding. He adjusted the IV protocol. He told her she'd be looking at 5 to 7 days before discharge, which she received with the expression of someone doing the math on how many things would need to happen in the next 5 to 7 days. When the attending left, she looked at Dominic and said, Hargrove's board of directors is going to meet within 48 hours. The hospital will need to operate through this. The trauma unit has 4 nurses and 2 attending physicians covering the current roster. That's not your problem right now. The patients in that unit are my problem. She said it simply, not with heat. I'm not going back in 2 days. But I need to know someone's made the staffing call. He hadn't thought about that. He realized, sitting in a hospital room with his bad coffee, that this was the thing she'd been carrying underneath everything else. Not just the case, not just surviving, but the fact that the trauma unit at Hargrove Regional was still running, still receiving patients. And the people in it didn't have what they needed because the man who ran the hospital's resources had been diverting them for years. I'll make a call, he said. To who? Someone who knows who to call. He wasn't certain of that, but he'd find a way to make it true. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and leaned back against the pillow and closed her eyes. He sat with her for another hour before his phone buzzed with a message from Ferris that pulled him back out into the hallway and changed the morning again. The message was 4 words. We have a name. The name was not one of the 2 shooters from the overpass, though that would come. The name belonged to someone else, someone whose involvement in the network hadn't appeared in Elena's documentation, hadn't appeared on the server extraction, hadn't appeared on any of the financial records they'd spent the night mapping. The name appeared in a communication on Harn's laptop, the one Okafor's forensics team had preserved at Senate Lake before it could be wiped. It was a single message, sent at 1:08 a.m. the previous night, before Harn had known his location had been identified, before the second redirect had failed, while he was still moving and still believed he had room. The message was addressed to a name Dominic didn't recognize, but the recipient's role, decoded from the context of the message, was unmistakable. It was a senior physician at Marvel General Hospital, the hospital where Elena was currently being monitored by a single federal agent with a room number in the public directory. Dominic was running before he'd finished reading. The hallway outside Elena's room was 30 meters and a corner turn from the elevator bank, and he covered it fast, phone already at his ear, Ferris picking up on the second ring. He didn't slow down. The physician at Marvel General, he said. Name and department. Dr. Ronan Spear, senior attending internal medicine. He's been on staff at Marvel for 9 years. Ferris's voice had the clipped precision of someone already moving on multiple tracks. The communication from Harn's laptop was sent at 1:08 a.m. It said, I read it. We're running Spear's financials now. We don't have enough yet for a warrant. You have enough to get him out of that building. Dominic hit the stairwell door with his shoulder. Elena's room number is in the public directory. He has access to every corridor in that hospital. I know. I have a unit 5 minutes out. I'm 30 seconds out. He took the stairs to the 4th floor because the elevator had a delay he couldn't afford. 4 flights. He wasn't breathing hard when he pushed through the stairwell door. 11 years of shift work had built the kind of baseline fitness that didn't announce itself. But his mind was running faster than his legs, mapping the floor layout from the one pass-through he'd done on arrival. Elena's room was 412. The corridor ran east-west. The nursing station sat at the intersection point, which meant anyone approaching from the main elevator bank would pass it. But the service corridor on the west end connected directly to the room wing without going past the desk. He turned east first, checking 412's door. Agent Sura was standing in the hallway outside it. She'd heard him coming and had her hand near her jacket when she registered his face. "Problem," he said, not a question. "What kind?" "Possible internal contact. Physician on staff." "Where's Elena?" "In the room. She asked me to step out while she—" He pushed the door open. Elena was in the bed, sitting up, and she was not alone. A man in a white coat was standing near the IV line with his back to the door, and for one fractured second Dominic's hand was on his holster before the man turned and showed him a face that was plainly confused and plainly not expecting to be the object of a law enforcement response. He was young, mid-30s, the kind of young that still looked young in a hospital setting, and his badge read Internal Medicine, Resident, and his name was not Ronan Spear. "I was checking her overnight labs," the resident said. He sounded like someone who had just realized his Tuesday had become something else entirely. Dominic looked at Elena. She had already clocked the energy he'd come in with. She was reading him. "Spear," he said. "Ronan Spear. Has he been in this room?" Her expression shifted, not recognition of the name, recognition of the category. "No. I haven't seen anyone senior since the attending this morning." Dominic looked at Sura, who looked at the resident, who looked at everyone and said, "Dr. Spear doesn't typically work this floor." "Where does he work?" "Internal medicine is on 6, sometimes 7. Sura was already on her radio. Dominic stepped back into the hallway. He looked at his phone. Ferris had sent a follow-up text. "Spear's car is in the physician lot. He badged into the building at 7:52 a.m. Last badge scan was floor 5 at 9:44. That was 30 minutes ago. Floor 5. One floor below them." Dominic told Sura to stay at the door and stay visible, then went to the nursing station and showed his badge and asked for a patient directory search. Not Elena, but any patient whose room placement would give a physician legitimate access to the 4th floor corridor without triggering flags. The charge nurse, a woman named Petra, who absorbed the situation faster than most people would have, pulled up the floor manifest and said, "Dr. Spear has one patient on 4, room 408. Mr. Albrecht admitted yesterday. Internal medicine consult. 408 was 4 doors from 412. Dominic walked to 408. He looked through the small window in the door. A man in his 70s was in the bed, sleeping. The room was otherwise empty. He stepped back. He stood in the corridor and looked west, toward the service corridor, and thought about where a man went when he had a legitimate reason to be in a building but needed to be somewhere specific without being watched. He went west. The service corridor on the 4th floor west wing ran behind the patient rooms, used for equipment transport and maintenance access. It was lit by fluorescent strips and smelled like disinfectant and floor polish. And it was empty when Dominic entered it except for a linen cart parked against the far wall. He moved slowly. He checked each service doorway. Supply closet, clean utility room, soiled utility room, the mechanical access panel for the nursing station's medication dispenser. The door to the clean utility room was not fully latched. He stood to the side of it. He could hear someone inside, not movement, just the particular quality of stillness that isn't actually still. The kind of stillness a person makes when they're waiting. He put his phone in his left hand, texted Sura a single word, utility, and then pushed the door open with his right and stepped in with his badge out and his other hand on his holster. Dr. Ronan Spear was standing against the far wall beside a shelving unit stacked with gauze and IV supplies. He was holding his own phone. He was not holding anything else. He was 51 years old, gray at the temples, with the careful posture of a man who spent his professional life projecting competence. Right now, the competence was wearing thin. He had the look of someone who had made a series of decisions that had seemed rational at each individual step, and had only now, standing in a supply closet on the 4th floor of a hospital, arrived at the cumulative destination of all of them. "Dr. Spear," Dominic said, "put the phone on the shelf and step away from it." Spear looked at him. His jaw moved once, like he was considering something, and then he set the phone on the shelf. "I was making a call," he said. His voice was even. Physician even, the practice neutrality of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "Know what you were making." Dominic crossed the room and picked up the phone without taking his eyes off Spear. The screen was lit, a number partially dialed, not yet connected. He couldn't confirm whose number it was, but Ferris's team would. You're going to come with me. I'm a senior physician on active shift. I have patients. Your patients will be covered. Dominic kept his voice level. You know why I'm here. Spear was quiet for a moment. Something in his face settled. The way things settle when the energy required to maintain them has been withdrawn. How much do you know? Enough to take you out of this building. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting from me. Dominic moved to the side of the doorway. Walk out. Spear walked out. He walked with the careful dignity of a man who had decided that whatever came next, he would not make it worse by resisting in a hospital hallway. And Dominic thought about the 11 years Colfax Harn had spent building this network, and the people he'd placed inside it. Not all of them hungry for money, some of them afraid, some of them in too deep to see an exit, some of them believing the rationale they'd been given. He didn't know which kind Spear was. It wasn't his job to figure it out. Sura met them at the intersection of the service corridor and the main hallway. Ferris's unit arrived 90 seconds later. 2 agents, unremarkable clothes, moving through a hospital with the practiced invisibility of people who had done this before. They took Spear out through the service entrance. Dominic went back to 412. He told Elena in the same efficient way he'd told her everything else. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, His name wasn't in my documentation. The server extraction found him. He was lateral to the main structure, not in the supply chain, not in the financial routing. He was access. Dominic sat in the chair. If anything happened to you here, he could have managed the medical response. She understood what that meant without it being explained. She looked at the IV line in her arm, and then looked at the door, and then looked at her hands in her lap. He was the contingency, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. How many more? Ferris thinks Spear is the last active piece. The server extraction has been running for 8 hours. If there were more contacts at this level, they'd have appeared. You think? I think the network was large enough to run for 4 years and small enough to be managed by one person. Harn didn't build something he couldn't control. Dominic looked at her. You're safe. She held his gaze. He could see her deciding whether to believe that. Not whether she trusted him, but whether the evidence supported it, which was how she evaluated everything. It took about 4 seconds. All right, she said. Ferris arrived at Marvel General at 11:40 a.m. She came to the room herself, which meant something, and she sat in the chair Dominic vacated and put a folder on the bed table and said, I owe you an accounting. Elena looked at the folder. Go ahead. What Ferris laid out over the next 40 minutes was the complete picture as federal investigators had assembled it overnight and into the morning. Harn in custody at a federal detention facility, awaiting arraignment. Spear in custody as of 40 minutes ago. Farron processed and transferred. Alderman Price cooperating fully, his cooperation already yielding documentation that reinforced Elena's testimony on 4 specific points. The 2 physicians from Hargrove who had been the primary chart falsifiers had both entered formal cooperation agreements and were now being debriefed. The other 4 had attorneys who were, according to Ferris, communicating with appropriate urgency. The 2 shooters from the overpass had been identified through a communication thread on Harn's laptop. Their names were Devin Storch and Marcus Pullum. Both had prior records in adjacent counties. Both had been used by the network for other physical work over the previous 2 years. Storch had been picked up at a bus station in a neighboring state at 6 a.m. Pullum had been located at a motel 12 miles from Cairo City at 9:30 and was in federal custody by 10:15. When Ferris finished, the room was quiet. Elena looked at the folder and didn't open it. The mental health hold that Harn filed, she said, formally rescinded as of this morning. It's been flagged in the system as fraudulent, and the documentation has been referred to the state licensing board for the physician whose name was used to authorize it. Ferris met her eyes. It will not appear in any record connected to you going forward. Elena nodded once. Ms. Voss? Ferris's voice shifted, not softer exactly, but with less of the operational layer over it. The testimony you gave yesterday is the spine of this prosecution. The documentation you built independently, under conditions that were actively hostile to your building it, is what made the difference between a case and a conviction. She paused. The U.S. Attorney's Office has asked me to communicate that formally. I heard you, Elena said. Not cold, just present with it, taking it in at the speed it could actually be absorbed. Ferris left at 12:30. Garrett came by at 1:15 and stayed for 20 minutes and mostly talked about the paperwork he was generating, which was his way of processing things. Dr. Mack appeared at 2:00 with the unbothered efficiency of a surgeon who had 3 other hospitals to visit today and wanted to check on the patient who had caused her the most interesting Tuesday of her recent career. She reviewed Elena's chart, confirmed the attending's assessment, and said, "You'll have a scar on the shoulder. The rib will heal fully. The lower wound—" She paused, reading something in the chart. "You're lucky the angle was what it was." "I know," Elena said. "Do you actually know, or are you saying that the way people say it?" Elena looked at her. "I know," she said again, and this time Mac accepted it. Dominic left at 3 p.m. to write his report, which was 37 hours overdue and required the kind of thorough accounting that his Sergeant Marcus Tell had been owed since 2:06 a.m. the previous morning. Marcus, when Dominic called him, said nothing for a moment and then said, "Did you at any point feel like this was going to end differently?" Dominic thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said, "a few times. But here we are. Here we are." Marcus told him to take 48 hours before coming back in, which was not a request. The arraignments began 4 days later. Colfax Harn was arraigned on 11 federal counts: conspiracy to commit federal drug trafficking, unlawful diversion of controlled substances, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, bribery of a public official, and solicitation of murder in the first degree, the last charge carrying a mandatory minimum that removed any ambiguity about where he was going and for how long. He stood in a federal courtroom in a suit that looked like it had been put on by someone who still believed presentation mattered, and the judge read the charges in the particular flat voice that federal courts use for things that are beyond the reach of performance, and Harn stood through it without visible reaction. The news coverage began that afternoon. Dominic watched some of it from his apartment, not all of it, just enough to understand what version of the story was being told publicly. The version being told was accurate in its broad strokes. A senior hospital administrator had run a multi-year supply diversion network through falsified medical dispatch protocols, had been exposed by internal documentation built by a trauma nurse, and had attempted to silence that nurse through a staged ambush that a patrol officer had interrupted. Federal investigation followed, arrests made, network dismantled. What the version didn't fully convey, because these versions never did, was what it had cost. The overpass at 2:19 a.m. The hours in a substation with insufficient supplies, and a woman managing 2 gunshot wounds with military discipline because the alternative was dying before anyone believed her. The way a man with 11 years of institutional power had been able to weaponize the infrastructure of care, hospitals, dispatch systems, emergency protocols, against the person who existed inside that infrastructure and had seen clearly what it was doing. That part didn't fit in a news cycle. It rarely did. Elena's name appeared in the coverage on the 3rd day, when the U.S. Attorney's Office released a statement that included her role. The statement described her as a trauma nurse at Hargrove Regional, who had independently documented the network over an extended period and whose testimony and evidence were central to the prosecution. It did not mention her military background because she had not authorized that to be released, and Ferris had respected that. Dominic read the statement twice and thought it was inadequate and accurate at the same time, which was the nature of official statements. He visited her on day 5. She was sitting up in the hospital bed with a tablet in her lap and 3 printed documents on the bed table. She looked better, not recovered, but no longer running on reserves. The color was back. The particular compression around her eyes from sustained pain management had eased. "You've been reading the coverage," he said, looking at the tablet. "Tracking it." She set the tablet aside. Hargrove's board of directors held an emergency session on day 2. They've brought in an external administrator and suspended all internal dispatch protocol pending a state audit. She picked up one of the documents. The state health department has opened a review of Hargrove in both secondary hospitals. It'll take 18 months minimum. "Is that good?" "It's necessary." She set the document down. The patients who went through those systems deserve to know what was done with their care. She looked at him. "The staffing call you made." He had reached the hospital administrator through Sylvia Rourke, who had reached the external management firm through a contact, who had reached someone with actual authority to act. It had taken 6 phone calls. Sorted, he said. I know, I checked. A pause. Thank you. You're welcome. She looked at this window. They offered me a settlement. Hargrove's attorney called my attorney yesterday. What kind? The kind that comes with a non-disclosure agreement. She turned from the window. I told them no. He had expected that. He nodded. I don't want their money, she said. I want the audit to finish and the results to be public and every patient whose records were falsified to have that falsification corrected in their medical history. She held his gaze. That's not a settlement. That's a consequence. Your attorney can push for that. She already is. The preliminary hearing for the Harn prosecution was scheduled 6 weeks out, and Elena was called as the primary witness for the evidentiary phase. She was formally cleared of the fraudulent mental health hold 3 weeks after her discharge from Marvel General, when the state licensing board completed its expedited review and issued a public finding that the documentation had been fabricated by an administrative process that Harn had controlled. The finding included the precise mechanism, the physician's name that had been used without that physician's knowledge, the forged authorization codes, the false record entry date. The finding was published. It was a public document. Anyone who searched Elena Voss's name in any professional database from that point forward would find the licensing board's finding alongside it, which meant they would find the exoneration alongside any attempt to use the fabricated record against her. She called Dominic when the finding came through. He was on shift, parked on Alderman Street, running plate checks for an unrelated case, and he answered on the second ring. It's published, she said. I saw. A pause. I didn't expect it to feel like anything in particular. Does it? Another pause, longer. Like putting something down that I didn't know I was still carrying. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was letting go of its grip. Which is not the same as it being over. The hearing is still 6 weeks out. There are people who haven't been sentenced yet. No, he agreed. It's not over. But it's something. Yeah, he said. It is. The federal prosecution moved faster than most, because the documentation was thorough and the cooperation was extensive, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had decided this was the kind of case worth accelerating. Harn's attorney filed 3 motions to suppress evidence in the 6 weeks before the preliminary hearing. All 3 were denied. At the hearing, Elena testified for 4 hours. She sat in a federal courtroom and walked through the documentation in the order she'd built it. The initial anomalies, the pattern recognition, the specific pharmaceutical categories, the dispatch code structure, the Van Trade financial trail, the military communication signature, and its operational context. She was cross-examined for 90 minutes by Harn's attorney, who was skilled and methodical, and who understood that the only avenue available was to suggest that Elena's military background had predisposed her to see operational conspiracies in ordinary administrative irregularities. Elena dismantled this in 13 minutes. She did it without raising her voice or changing her pace. She did it by walking through the specific documentary evidence point by point, not the interpretation, the documents themselves, each one verified by independent forensic analysis, each one cross-referenced against the server extraction, each one traceable to a transaction or communication that Harn himself had generated. She did it the way she did everything, thoroughly, without drama, from a position of having built her case before anyone knew she was building it. The judge sustained 2 objections to the cross-examination line of questioning before Harn's attorney abandoned it. When Elena stepped down from the stand, the courtroom was quiet for a moment before the procedural machinery resumed. She walked back to the federal prosecutor's table and sat down and looked straight ahead, and Dominic, sitting in the gallery behind the bar, watched the back of her head and thought about an overpass and a woman with a gun, and the question she'd asked him, "How long have you been on shift?" before she decided whether to trust him. He had never fully answered that question. Not what she was really asking. She'd been asking whether he was clean, whether he was someone she could risk being honest with. He thought about that. He thought about the fact that the right answer, the one that had led to everything that followed, hadn't been any particular quality of his. It had just been the truth. 6 p.m. I clocked in at 6 p.m. He'd been too surprised by the question to think about what answer would serve him better. And so he'd told her the truth, and she'd made a calculation, and here they were. There were worse ways for things to begin. Colfax Harn was sentenced 8 months after his arraignment, The federal judge handed down 32 years on the conspiracy and trafficking charges, with the solicitation of murder charge running concurrent and adding a mandatory enhancement that removed the possibility of parole consideration before the 20-year mark. The sentence was delivered in the same flat courtroom voice that had read the charges at arraignment, and Harn received it with the same absence of visible reaction and was remanded immediately. Alderman Price, whose cooperation had been genuine and extensive, received 4 years, with credit for time served and the cooperation reduction applied. His attorney called it a good outcome. The federal prosecutor said nothing about it publicly. Captain Louis Farron received 7 years on the corruption and conspiracy charges. His attorney appealed. The appeal was denied 11 months later. Ronan Speer, the physician at Marvel General, pleaded guilty to 3 charges: conspiracy, obstruction, and misprision of a felony for his role in being available to manage Elena's potential medical situation. He received 18 months and a permanent revocation of his medical license. The license revocation was, by most accounts, the punishment that landed hardest. The 6 Hargrove physicians were sentenced on a range of charges from 6 months to 4 years, depending on their level of involvement and the degree of their cooperation. All 6 had their medical licenses suspended pending review. 3 were permanently revoked. 3 were suspended for periods ranging from 2 to 5 years with conditions. Storch and Pullum, the 2 who had waited for Elena under the overpass, were sentenced to 18 years apiece on charges of attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy, and federal firearms violations. They had not cooperated. The evidence against them didn't require it. The State Health Department audit of Hargrove Regional and the 2 secondary hospitals took 22 months. Its findings were published in a report that ran to 460 pages and documented, in precise clinical and financial detail, the scope of what had been done to a regional healthcare system by one man with access and patience and a learned contempt for the people around him. The report made specific recommendations for systemic changes to dispatch protocol oversight, pharmaceutical inventory verification, and the independence of internal audit functions from administrative control. 3 other states cited the report within 18 months of its publication and began their own reviews. The patients whose records had been falsified, 47 individuals across 4 years and 3 facilities, were formally notified and offered corrected records in a review process. Most accepted. A few sued. The suits were settled. None of it was sufficient, which is the nature of most institutional accountability. It arrives late, it speaks in documents, and it cannot give back what was taken. But it arrived. Elena returned to nursing 9 months after the overpass. Not to Hargrove. Hargrove was still under external administration and structural review, and would be for some time, and she did not want to return to a place that was still being excavated. She took a position at a trauma center in a city 2 hours from Cairo City, smaller and newer, and built without the kind of institutional sediment that had let Harn's operation hide inside Hargrove's bureaucracy for 4 years. She took the position as a trauma nurse specialist, the same title she'd held at Hargrove, and she asked for one additional thing when she accepted the offer: a structured training program, 2 hours per month, mandatory for all nursing staff, on documentation protocols for clinical irregularities. How to notice, how to record, how to report through channels that were actually independent of the people being reported on. The hospital administration agreed, partly because the state audit had made such programs advisable, and partly because the department head who interviewed Elena had read the 460-page report and understood what a structured documentation habit, applied by one trauma nurse across 11 weeks, had been able to accomplish. The program ran its first session 4 months after Elena started. 8 nurses attended. She stood at the front of a conference room in scrubs and talked about anomaly recognition, not as an investigative skill, not as anything dramatic, but as a clinical habit. The same rigor you apply to a patient's chart applied to the system around the patient. The same question you ask about a medication interaction, asked about a pattern that doesn't add up. She told them it was the most important thing she'd learned in trauma nursing. She didn't tell them where she'd learned to look that carefully. Some things belonged to other contexts. Dominic drove out for the first session. He sat in the back of the conference room and watched her teach, and he thought about the way she'd walked him through applying the field dressings under an overpass, calm and specific, and the way she was doing the same thing now, precise, undramatic, treating the people in front of her like they were capable of understanding something real. She had always been teaching. She'd just had different students. After the session, they went to a diner 2 blocks from the hospital. It was the kind of place with laminate menus and coffee that was either excellent or terrible depending on the time of day. This was mid-afternoon, so it was terrible, but they ordered it anyway. 8 people, he said. First session. Next month will be more. She turned her coffee cup on the saucer. Word gets around. You seem... He stopped, picking for the right word because she deserved precision. Settled. She considered this. Not settled. Purposeful. She looked up. There's a difference. Settled sounds like things have stopped moving. They haven't. She turned the cup again. But I know where I'm standing. He thought about that. He thought about the version of this conversation that existed in the world where he'd walked away from the overpass because a woman with a gun told him to stay back. It wasn't a difficult thing to imagine. He'd been tired. It was 2 a.m. The call had been logged as a vehicle accident, and she'd been the one insisting he leave. The decision to stop and help had not felt significant at the time. It had not even felt particularly brave. It had just felt like the thing in front of him that needed doing. He wondered sometimes how many things in the world had stayed broken because the person who found them, at 2 a.m., in the middle of their 11th year of doing the same job, had decided they were too tired to look more closely. I've been thinking about something, Elena said. What? The question of why Harn thought it would hold. She set the coffee down. I was not a stupid man. He designed a sophisticated system and maintained it for 4 years across multiple institutions. He had contingencies. She looked at the window. But his fundamental assumption was that nobody on the inside would look carefully enough to find it. That the people around him, nurses, residents, administrative staff, were too busy, too tired, too contained by their own lane to ask questions outside of it. He was almost right. He was right about almost everyone, she said. That's the part that stays with me. She turned from the window. Not that he underestimated me. That he had 11 years of evidence that the system would protect itself and exclude the people most likely to notice. That's not arrogance. That's a learned behavior based on accurate data. Dominic had no good response to that, because she was correct. The training program isn't about catching the next Harn, she said. It's about making the assumption wrong. About creating enough people who look carefully enough that the math stops working. She picked up her coffee. 1 person with documentation almost didn't survive. 8 people with documentation habits, in 1 hospital, in 1 city. That's a different equation. He drank his terrible coffee. You're going to take that program to other hospitals. She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Outside the diner window, the city moved through its afternoon in the way that cities did. People on their way somewhere, making decisions that felt small and were also, in aggregate, everything. Dominic thought about a patrol career that had not made him famous or promoted or particularly comfortable, and he thought about what it meant that the most important thing he'd ever done in it had taken less than a second to decide. He thought about the patch of blue scrub fabric she'd given him later, when she was well enough to make the gesture, a torn piece from the uniform she'd been wearing at the overpass. He kept it in the inside pocket of his jacket, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of the night, as a reminder of the truth he'd learned in the space between not walking away and not knowing why. That the person in front of you is rarely who you think they are, and that the most dangerous assumption you can make about someone is that you've already understood them. You saved me that night, Elena said. He shook his head. You survived. I just made sure you got the chance. She looked at him for a moment. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. She turned back to the window. The afternoon light was doing something ordinary and specific to the street outside, catching the glass of a building across the way, spreading low and gold across the sidewalk, making ordinary things look briefly like something worth looking at. She sat with her hands around her coffee and her eyes forward, and she looked like a person who had been through something large and had found, on the other side of it, not a return to what she'd been, but something different, harder in some ways, clearer in others. In the kind of person who would stand in a conference room the following month and the month after that and teach people to look carefully, because looking carefully was the only thing that had ever actually made a difference. The kind of person who had been in that trauma unit for 4 years, quiet and overlooked, and building towards something that nobody had believed was coming, until it arrived, documented and irrefutable, And the man who had counted on her invisibility discovered what her silence had been doing the entire time. Some people wear their strength like armor. You see it immediately, and you calibrate yourself accordingly. Elena Voss had always worn hers like nothing at all, like the ordinariness of a nurse in blue scrubs moving through a hospital corridor, doing the work, keeping the record, waiting for the moment when the record would speak louder than everything that had been built to silence it. That moment had come. And the truth, when it finally arrived, had not been gentle or forgiving or particularly clean. It had been documented, precise, and total, exactly as she had built it.